Lectures on the Basics of Biblical Greek. Chapter 10. In the next major block of lessons, we'll expand our knowledge of the Greek noun and of concepts related to the Greek noun. In Chapter 10, this lesson, we'll learn the third declension, the declension which has a consonant as its stem. In Chapter 11, we'll look at all the forms of the first and second person pronouns, I, we, and you. In Chapter 12, we'll explore the third person pronoun, he, she, it, they. Interestingly, this particular word, autos, can function in 3 different ways. Chapter 13 gives us the demonstrative pronouns, this and that. Chapter 14, the relative pronouns, used in relative clauses. With the exception of the third declension, all of these other forms will use endings that you've learned before. So there's going to be a lot of consolidation and reinforcement in this major unit of material. Now we turn to our current lesson. In previous chapters, we have learned the first and second declensions, here exemplified by the forms of the definite article. One can see the endings in yellow and various connecting vowels in the various forms. This is the actual chart of case endings, and it's always good to review this chart. For the first and second declensions, they are for the nominative singular, sigma, nothing, new. Genitive, upsilon, sigma, upsilon. Dative, iota, 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 which always subscripts in the first and second declensions. Accusative, new, new, new. And then in the plurals, iota, iota, alpha, omega nu, omega nu, omega nu for the genitive, iota, sigma, across for the dative, and upsilon, sigma, sigma, alpha for the accusative in the plural. In this lesson, we're going to look at the third declension, the case ending chart through which we learn the endings of the third declension. We'll walk through a common paradigm of a third declension noun, sarx. It's the one noun that we'll memorize. Then we'll look at other examples by which we can figure out the cases from the endings. We'll be introduced in this lesson to the square of stops, rule number 7. Of noun rules, what happens when certain consonants collide, and finally a few miscellaneous items. Yes, it is a bit of a long lesson. The third declension is often called the consonantal declension, whereas the first declension, the stem ended in alpha or eta, and in the second declension, the stem ends in an omicron. In the third declension, the stem ends in a consonant. And so although the endings look somewhat different, the meanings of the various cases are the same, and the function is the same. A nominative continues to function either as a subject or predicate nominative. A genitive can be possessive or object of a preposition or a number of other uses. Dative can be indirect object or with a preposition that covers that case. Accusative, direct object, or with a preposition that governs that case, or a few other uses as we go along. The point is, third declension, the stem is consonantal. So what are the case endings for the third declension? I'm keeping the first and second declensions on the left as we work through these so that you can see where the similarities and differences are. The nominative singular adds a sigma in the masculine and feminine, and nothing in the neuter. So that ending is the same as the second declension masculine, but the neuter again is slightly different. In the genitive singular, the ending is quite different. Omicron sigma. Yes, in the feminine genitive singular there's a sigma, but it follows an alpha or an eta. So this ending is entirely new. And here, the omicron along with the sigma are both part of the case ending. Actually, the genitive singular is the most important case ending because from the genitive singular, one can see the stem of a third declension noun. The dative singular is just like the dative singular in first and second declensions. It's a iota. The difference is, in the first and second declension, the iota subscripts. But in the third declension, the iota doesn't, because it's following a consonant. The accusative singular in the masculine and feminine can either be alpha or nu. Alpha is a nu ending. And the neuter accusative singular is just like the nominative neuter singular. Nothing. In the nominative plurals, we have a nu ending with the masculine and feminine, epsilon sigma. But the nominative neuter plural is an alpha, just like in almost every other case that we have seen. The genitive plural couldn't be easier. It's omega nu, just as we have seen previously in the first and second declensions. The dative dative plural, is sigma iota, sometimes followed by a movable nu. That looks different unless you recognize it's just the reverse of the iota sigma we had in the previous data plurals. Sigma iota for the dative plural. And then finally, the accusative plural, masculine and feminine, is alpha sigma, where the alpha is part of the case ending, not part of the stem, as in the feminine accusative singular of the first declension. And then again, alpha with the accusative neuter plural. So the new forms are highlighted in blue on the chart. Omicron sigma for the genitive singular, for both masculine, feminine, and neuter. The occasional use of alpha for the accusative singular. Epsilon sigma in the nominative plural, and alpha sigma in the accusative plural. Everything else is fairly straightforward, or twisted about, but nonetheless easy to remember. Now let's look at how these case endings appear as we walk through the various forms of SARS. When learning a third declension noun, it's always important to know the genitive singular, because in the genitive singular, one can see the stem. The stem of SARS is sark, ending with a kappa, plus omicron sigma gives us the genitive singular form sarkos. When we turn then to the nominative, we see that a change has happened. The stem, sark, plus a sigma gives us sarks, not kappa sigma, but the two combining to form a xi. This is the product of the square of stops that we'll talk about later. The dative singular adds a iota to the stem. Very simple, sarki. The accusative singular adds an alpha. Again, the form is simple, sarka. In the nominative plural, our new ending, epsilon sigma, appears, added to the stem sark, yielding sarkas. The genitive plural by this time should be easy, sarkon. And in the dative plural, the sigma iota that's added to sark does the same thing as in the nominative when a sigma is added to the kappa ending, and we get sarksi instead of sarksi. Lastly, the accusative plural is sarkos, where an alpha sigma is added to the stem. So we have the full declension of sarks. Sarks, sarkos, sarki, sarka, sarkes, sarkon, sarksi, sarkas. Notice in the genitive and dative of both numbers, the accent moves to the right, to the final syllable, to the ultima, and in the genitive plural becomes a circumflex. Let's look at a couple of examples. He sarks apoktene. Notice how the article tells you that sarks is feminine, even if you didn't remember. The flesh kills. In the second example, N governs the dative case. See the iota, not subscripted. And sarkimu, in my flesh. The third example, he epithemia tes sarkos. The tes sarkos form is genitive. The desire of the flesh. Now that we have the basics of the third declension, let's look at some other examples of third declension nouns. With the case endings that you've learned, you should be able to identify the form with just a little help in a couple of places. There is a class of third declension nouns called mot stems because their stem ends in mu, alpha, tau. And you can see that stem in the genitive singular if you take off the genitive singular ending omicron sigma. Onomat is the stem of onoma. The nominative singular is formed because the tau does not stand at the end, so it drops off. And a nominative singular neuter and an accusative singular neuter are going to be identical. By the way, all mot stems are neuter. The genitive singular is onomatos. The dative singular is onomati. Notice the unsubscripted iota. It's not subscripted under the tau. It just sits there on the end. In the nominative plural, onomat has an alpha added for the nominative plural, an omega nu added for the genitive plural. The dative plural, when a C is added to the tau drops out, and so one gets onomacy. This is another example of the square of stops that we'll talk about in a little bit. And then the accusative plural is identical to the nominative plural neuter, onomata. Another stem that shows up frequently in the third declension is the nu stem, where the stem of the third declension noun, or in this case pronoun, ends in a nu. Notice tin is our stem here. And so the forms are tis and ti, sigma added to the masculine feminine, nothing added to the neuter, tinos, tini, tina, alpha added to the masculine feminine form, nothing added to the neuter form, and that ending nu dropped off. In the plurals, tines for the masculine feminine, tina for the neuter, tinon and tinon, tissi and tissi, again just as in the nominative, and then tinas and tina for the accusative plurals. This particular form, tis ti, with an accent on the first syllable, this form is the interrogative pronoun. Who? ? Or what ? Depending on the gender of the antecedent. I've now added a second chart of tis, ti forms, but notice the accents are different. Rather than being on the initial syllable, if it's a monosyllabic form, it has no accent. If it is a bisyllabic form, the accent is on the final or ultima syllable. These are enclitic forms of tis, ti, and they are not the interrogative pronoun, but the indefinite pronoun. Someone or something. So when one runs into forms of tis and ti in Koine Greek, pay very close attention to the accents. It's the editor telling you whether it's the interrogative or the indefinite pronoun. Interrogative asks question. Indefinite talks about someone or something. Again, the key, if the accent is on the first syllable, it's interrogative. If it's on the second syllable or doesn't exist, it's indefinite. In our first example, t, you will notice, has an accent. So that word means what? This particular interrogative question does not have a verb, so we have to supply it, is, what is a name to you? The form soy means to you. It's a dative singular. What is a name to you? In the second example, notice the tis has no accent. It's not the interrogative pronoun. The other hint is there's no question mark at the end of the sentence. It's the indefinite pronoun. Someone is speaking her name. That's the way the second sentence translates. So again, the presence or absence of an accent on the first syllable is critical with tis tit. I have mentioned the square of stops twice before in explaining why a nominative or a dative looks the way it does. It's now time to talk about that in more detail. There are certain letters which interrupt the flow of air through the mouth when one speaks those letters. Sometimes that flow of air is interrupted with the lips. The lips close down and the flow of air is briefly stopped, as in P, beta, and phi. In all three cases, the lips interrupt the flow of air. These are called labials. A second class of stops occurs when the flow of air is interrupted by the throat. These are called velars or sometimes gutturals. Kappa, gamma, chi. Notice how the interruption occurs further back in the mouth. And then there are the dentals. When one enunciates these letters, airflow is interrupted by the teeth, as in tau, delta, or theta. An interesting thing happens when one then appends a sigma to one of these forms. A labial, that's where the airflow is interrupted by the lips, plus a sigma, translates those two consonants into one, the psi. So P plus sigma is psi, beta plus sigma becomes a psi, and phi plus sigma becomes a psi. The velars, those sounds made down in the throat, kappa, gamma, and chi, when a sigma is added to any of those, it becomes a xi. So kappa plus sigma is xi. Gamma plus sigma is xi. Chi plus sigma is xi. With the dentals, where the airflow is interrupted by the teeth, as in tau, delta, or theta, a dental plus a sigma just causes the dental to disappear. Only a sigma remains. So tau plus sigma equals sigma. Delta plus sigma equals sigma. Theta plus sigma equals sigma. The square of stops explains what happens when some of these sigma-based endings are added to consonantal stems. Watch for the changes in the nominative singular and dative plural. And now for a few miscellaneous items to end the lesson. The adjective one, as in one book, one day, one work, the adjective one is heis mia hen. It is an adjective that is in the 3-1-3 pattern. That means the masculines are third declension, the feminines are first declension, the neuters are third declension. Please don't confuse heis, one, with ace, in two. Notice heis has a rough breathing mark. The same thing is true for the word hen. It has a rough breathing mark and ought not be confused with the preposition "n." When one looks carefully at the forms, one can see that the third declension stem is epsilon nu. We learn that by looking at the genitive singular and taking that case ending off. The other changes are normal. A sigma added to a nu causes the sigma to drop out, and then the epsilon lengthens to epsilon iota. In the dative singular, of course, the iota cannot subscript, so henny, and in the accusative singular, henna. In the neuter, there is no ending for the neuter nominative singular, so just the stem, hen, henos, henny, and hen follow logically. The feminine is based on a totally different stem, mia, to which the standard first declension case endings are added. Nothing, sigma, iota subscripted, and nu. Obviously, there's no plural for the adjective one. A very common adjective is the adjective pas, meaning every in the singular or all in the plural. It is also a 3-1-3 adjective, with its stem in the masculine and neuter being pant. Look at the genitive singular to figure that out. P alpha nu tau. And in the feminine, the stem is P alpha sigma alpha. And the alpha changes to eta in the genitive and dative. Remember the rule? Alpha changes to eta except after epsilon, iota, or rho. Well, it's following a sigma, so it changes. The forms then are pas, pasapon for the nominative singular, pantos, passes, pantos for the genitive singular, and so forth. Again, 3-1-3 in pattern. Just by way of note, the stem, pant, when it has no ending, as in the neuter, nominative singular, and accusative singular, the tau drops off. That's why the form is pan. Obviously, panta of the masculine accusative singular and panta of the nominative and accusative neuter plurals can be ambiguous, and the context will help you figure them out. Let's look at some examples. Panta ta onomata, all the names. The second example, pasa hain sarx. Well, sarx is feminine. If you don't remember that, the article tells you that, and thus for the adjective to agree, it must be of that particular form of pas, the first declension feminine. And then the third example, the translation for the second example is all flesh. The third example, pan onoma, every name. Now, if you recall your adjectives well, you'll notice that none of the examples of pas have an article in front of them. Pas never has an article in front of it. It's always in the it's always an arthrous, but most of the time it will be attributive, that is, saying something about a noun with which it agrees. So with the examples of haste me a hen and pasapon, we now have a number of different examples of adjective categories. Our old friend agathos is a 2-1-2. Today we learned pasapon, that's a 3-1-3. Haste me a hen is also a 3-1-3. Previously we learned ionios, on, which is a 2-2. And then of course we learned the interrogative and indefinite pronouns today, which are 3-3. So all of these patterns show up. One other little odd element in Greek. Honestly, one can add an article to just about anything and make something of it in Greek, and we see that here with hode, and I provide a couple of other examples that aren't in your textbook, hede and hoide. Simply adding the article to the conjunction makes it into a pronoun. Hode, but he. Hede, but she. Hoide, but they. Again, the article plus de can function like a pronoun. Hoida horasin kai pistiusin. They see and believe. Previously, we talked about noun rules, such as rule number 1, stems ending in alpha or eta are first declension, omicron are second. Now we add stems ending in consonants are third declension. Neuter nouns have identical nominative and accusative cases in each number. We saw that in the third declension also. Almost all neuters use an alpha in the nominative accusative plural. Thank goodness, that really helps with the third declension. In the dative singular, the iota subscripts, if possible. In the first and second declension, it did. In the third, it doesn't. Vowels often change their length. They ablaut. We've seen that, for example, with heis me a hen, where the epsilon lengthened. In the genitive and dative, the masculine and neuter will always be identical. That holds true in the third declension as well, as we saw in the charts. The two new noun rules we added in this lesson are the square of stops, where a labial plus sigma becomes psi, a velar plus sigma becomes xi, and a dental plus a sigma just becomes a dental. And then rule number 8, a tau cannot stand at the end of a word and will drop off. And we've had some dropping taus today as well. So that's our lesson. It's a rather long one, admittedly. We looked at the third declension. We added the case-ending chart. I suggest you commit it to memory. We walked through sarx. We looked at other examples such as onoma and tiste. We talked about the square of stops, how different letters are used to handle the interrupted flow of air in Greek, and then a few miscellaneous items, including the very important adjective pas.